What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be breaking down the top 5 tips I have for brewing your best stouts and porters. As the weather gets colder, it is certainly turning into stout and porter season, and I'm very excited because these are some of my favorite beers. The first tip I have for you is to understand the subcategory of the stout you're brewing. Not all stouts are created equal. An Irish stout is an incredibly different beer than an imperial stout. So just keeping all that in mind, visualize what your final stout product should be and understand the subtle differences between them. If you're brewing an Irish stout, for example, it should be dry. It should have really no more than like 4 different malts in it, and only one of them should be roasted, and it should be produced to be about 4 to 5% alcohol, right? But if you're brewing an imperial stout, you're looking at essentially doubling the alcohol content of the Irish stout, doubling the amount of ingredients involved, doubling the aging time. There's just so much that's different about these two beers. The point I'm trying to make here is that the subcategories of stouts and porters really are very, very diverse. And many other beer styles out there are pretty narrow in terms of their guidance, but stouts and porters, just like IPAs, have a million different sub-variations that are all very, very different from each other. So before you even start to think about making your recipe, just do a quick dive into the BJCP style guidelines for the beer you're trying to make and just try to review that. Make sure you keep an idea of what makes the most sense for this type of beer. In an effort to keep this video as generic and useful as possible, I'm gonna try and focus on tips that apply to most of these styles of stout and porter out there. But there are some very specialized ones, like Irish stout, that aren't gonna really play by the rules. So with that in mind, most of the tips in the rest of this video are going to be focused on the American styles of stout, porter, imperial stout, barrel-aged stuff, the like. These are big, bold, intense flavored beers that can range from sweet to roasty and have lots of flavorings added to them or just be served on their own as they are as a base beer. There's a lot of things you could do with stout and porter, and I'm gonna try my best to keep it concise. But again, don't be afraid to visit the BJCP really quickly and just make sure you understand what you are trying to make. Tip number 2 involves the grist composition. Stouts and porters are unequivocally malty beers. These are recipe-driven beers that are built from the malts, and they really do need a lot of care when it comes to crafting the right malt bill. Depending on how intense you want certain flavor characteristics to be, these numbers can generally kind of tweak themselves a little bit, but what I recommend doing is the following breakdown of 4 key types of malts. Firstly, base malt. For your base malt, we're looking at usually a pale ale malt. I've known of a few stouts that have actually been made with Pilsner malt as a base, but I do recommend pale ale malt, specifically English pale ale malt, is a fantastic base malt. Something like Maris Otter, Golden Promise, similar stuff like that. For your typical full-bodied, satisfying stout or porter, I'd recommend about 60% of the grist be base malt, pale ale malt. Secondly, to start bridging the gap between your base malts and your more heavily flavored malts, you're gonna need something like Munich or Vienna malt, or a combination of the two to get that done. These are toasted malts. They're a little bit more intense in flavor than your base malt, but they're not nearly as intense as a caramel malt or a roasted malt. Munich and Vienna malts are perfect for the job, and they're going to give you a nice toastiness and a little bit of like a nuttiness usually to get that gap between the breadiness of the base and the sweetness of your specialty malts. So I'd recommend adding in about 20% of the overall grist for Munich, Vienna, or a combination of the two. Next, we gotta talk about crystal malts. Crystal malts are pretty important for not only raising that final gravity to get you a little bit more sweetness, smoothness, and kind of full-bodied character, but they also can provide very specific flavors that can be desirable in stouts and porters. So there's generally 3 different kinds of caramel malts. You've got light, medium, and dark caramel malts. There's also extra dark ones and extra light ones, but for the purposes of this video, I'm not gonna talk about those. On the light side of things, about maybe like 10 to 30 lava bond, you're gonna get flavors like golden raisins and honey and intensified biscuit notes. In the medium range, which is about 30 to 60 lava bond, you're gonna get things like toasted marshmallows, toasted caramel, more of a deeper, richer raisin character. Sometimes nuttiness can come out of these malts as well. Sometimes these malts can impart like a graham cracker or a biscuit flavor as well. And then the dark side, from 70 lava bond onward, is going to have things like dark roasted caramel flavors, burned sugar, dark raisin character, plums, prunes, figs, dark fruits like that. Because these malts kind of contained effectively burned sugars, you're going to get burned sugar flavors in your beer when you use these in excess. Because each level of kilning on these caramel malts is going to get you different flavors, I actually recommend using a little bit of each in all of your stouts. You're going to want to probably dial back the dark stuff though, because it can impart that very acrid, harsh, burned sugar character if you're not careful. Overall though, the caramel malt contribution should be about 10%. And then finally we have the ingredient that makes these beers what they are, dark, roasty beers, roasted malt, right? Not all roasted malts are made the same. But the key thing here is don't use a lot of them because a little bit goes a long way. I would honestly say about 2 to 5% overall of the grist should be roasted malt because it can get very intense very fast. And I also recommend adding complexity within your roasted malts. Just like crystal malts, I'd recommend adding like 3 different kinds of roasted malts into the grist overall. For me, that looks like a combination of either pale or dark chocolate malt or both, adding in some roasted barley and sometimes some carafa as well. All 3 of these roasted malts are very different in their character, but when they're blended together, you get this really cool effect. Don't sleep on midnight wheat or chocolate rye or any of these other variations of roasted malt. They can add cool characteristics to your beer, and depending on what you want out of your final stout or porter, they can be pretty powerful ingredients as well. Tip number 3 is going to be all about water chemistry, and it's kind of an obligatory tip in each one of these videos, but these are very important levers to pull. Depending on the stout or porter recipe you're brewing, you might want to tweak that chloride to sulfate ratio to increase the chloride level relative to the sulfate, making the beer a bit fuller, maltier, that sort of thing. Usually that's going to be the case, but sometimes it's not going to be the case. So just again, pay attention to what kind of stout you're trying to brew there and whether that matters or not. More important though than the sulfate to chloride ratio is actually going to be your pH levels. When you're brewing with roasted grains, they're acidic, so they're going to drop the mash pH a little bit further than you might expect if you were brewing without them. Having the beer be too acidic throughout the entire process is going to do a few different things. First of all, in the mash, it's going to reduce your conversion efficiency, and now you're not going to get the OG that you want out of the beer. Secondly, it's going to cause an intensification of acrid, harsh flavors. It can be very off-putting with roasted malts in the mix. And thirdly, it will tend to thin out the body of the beer a little bit as well. And if you're looking for a full-bodied stout, that can also be off-putting. There's a few different ways we can fix this problem. Firstly, we can try to add a basic or alkaline element to the brewing water itself. Adding a little bit of baking soda or pickling lime or chalk into the brewing water can do a lot when it comes to buffering it and preventing the pH from dropping too far due to the addition of these acidic malts. Alternatively, you could do what's really become my standard practice now and add your roasted malts at the very end of the mash. By going through the mash with everything but your roasted malts, you're going to actually have a pretty standard mash pH that's going to be under control. And then when you add those roasted malts at the very end, they infuse their flavor and their color into the wort very, very quickly. The starches in roasted malts have been pretty much obliterated by the roasting process, so they're not going to be contributing any real significant levels of sugar. So it doesn't really matter if you're adding them at the very end. What I like to do is get the mash all the way through the process, get it to mash out, and then add in those roasted malts right around mash out. Let them steep for about 15 minutes or so. And that's just enough time to get the color, to get the flavor, and it has worked out so well for me. And that's pretty much all I do now when it comes to making stouts. This also has the added benefit of reducing astringency that you could get from these roasted grains, which can be very off-putting, and it reduces the aging time required for these beers as well. The next tip I have for you is to focus on your desired finishing gravity and mouthfeel. Do you want your beer to finish dry or sweet? Do you want your beer to have light body or full body? These things are very, very important when it comes to designing the recipe for a stout or porter because you have the option of going either direction depending on the style of stout or porter you're trying to make. But there's a few levers you can pull to influence that final result. Firstly is that sulfate to chloride ratio. A higher sulfate to chloride ratio will increase that perception of dryness for the final result. But if you flip that around and you have more chloride than sulfate, then it will increase the fullness and the final kind of smoothness of that beer. It'll make it feel maltier and sweeter, which most of the time is what you want for these beers. Also, what's your level of bitterness for this beer? How do you want that balanced? Reducing that bitterness makes it feel sweeter, which also is linked in our minds to a fuller, thicker tasting beer. For that final gravity and the level of sweetness versus dryness, picking your yeast strain appropriately, a high attenuating or a low attenuating strain. Also, your mash temperature. Do you want to mash that beer at a high temperature or a low temperature in relation to the yeast strain you chose to get a high or low level of attenuation overall? Balancing all those things in conjunction with each other is really key to getting that final feeling of the beer that you want. And also keep in mind, a high gravity version of these beers is going to ferment differently than a low gravity version. Do you want this beer to be 6% or 12%? High gravity stouts and porters are going to finish a lot higher as well. They're going to have extra sweetness there. So keep in mind, okay, if I want this to not be excessively sweet, then I should add extra bittering hops, or I should mess with the water profile to make it still feel balanced at the end of the day. Most of the time, what you're after is balance. So just keep that in mind as you're designing your recipe. The final tip I have for you on these beers is you need to let them sit in condition a little bit. It's very tempting to want to get a full flavored, just smooth, balanced, perfect porter or stout within like 2 weeks, but that's not always going to happen. If you take care of your fermentation and if your recipe characteristics aren't excessive and you're not trying to add tons of flavors to these beers and you're not really, getting excessive amounts of roasted malts in there, these can be turned around pretty well. Reliably in like 2 to 3 weeks. But if you've got high alcohol stouts, if you've got intense flavors in there, if you're tossing them in a barrel, if you've got spices in, or like coffee and chocolate flavors in there that need time to mingle and marry and come out in a totally different way than they went in, that requires time and patience, and sometimes that's very, very hard to do for these beers. Stouts and porters age differently than other beers, and they age very well. So it's one of those things where I know you can get a good, drinkable, satisfying beer relatively fast, but if you give these beers time to condition and age, then man, they get so good. Just like taking the time to like really lager out a beer for a long period of time, or letting a barley wine age in condition, letting a Belgian ale age in condition. All of these strong, intensely flavored beers really benefit from time, and it's always worth it. It's a quick and easy tip to tell you, and it's one that's very easily ignored as well, but I do really just recommend sit down, be patient, crack these beers a month or two down the road, and they can be totally different and so rewarding sometimes. So just be patient. That's my final tip for you. So there's my top 5 tips for brewing great stouts and porters. As always, if you have experience brewing these beer styles and you have something that you do that I didn't mention here today, please drop it down in the comments section below, because there's a hell of a lot more than 5 things you can do to make your stouts and porters great. And I highly recommend, if you're trying to get smart on this subject, read the comments section. There's a lot of knowledge down there, not just what I'm putting out here. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe as well if you haven't already. And of course, comment down below as well. If you want to support the channel, please consider picking up a t-shirt like this design. I have this design and plenty of others in my merchandise store, which is linked down in the description box below. I also have a Patreon. It means so much to me to have your support week to week, and I have really struggled to get these videos out consistently. It's been a very, very busy year for me. But I really do appreciate the support you're giving. It means a ton to me. If Patreon is not your thing though, I also have channel memberships, and there's the super thanks button, both of which you can find down below the video. I have an Amazon store as well, where you can find all of my recommended homebrewing gear, as well as the channel production equipment as well. If it's all available on Amazon and I've used it, it's on that list. If you want to follow me in more than just YouTube, I'm also available on Instagram and Facebook as The Apartment Brewer, so check out those links for some more frequent content updates, and you get to see what's coming to the channel in the future. And that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. I hope you're able to make a great stout or porter after watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. And if you did, let me know. Anyway guys, I will catch you in the next one, and until then, cheers.